Right, I will start. As you know, this is the last lecture of the course. And I wanted to find a discussion that would bring together some of the different words that I used or examined in previous discussions. And I think the word liberal does do this. And we can see this, I hope, as I talk. That is, I wanted, through this word liberal, both bring together what I've said and say something that is perhaps very relevant to us, and certainly relevant to me, as the word liberal is often a description that is used about me. And you can judge whether it is properly used about me or not. But first I will talk about this word. It's the difficulties of understanding the word come from the fact that it is very common and very casually used, very informally used, and often, and hence it can mean different things in different settings. And whenever you hear the word, you need to ask yourself what, at this moment, is in fact being meant. You can't go to a dictionary and find the right answer to what is meant. You have to think about what's being said, because it's used so much and so, as I say, casually, not formally, but casually. A lot of English language is like this. Increasingly, I think, the English language in particular is becoming very, very informal. And it's a function of the fact that it's used in so many different places by so many people with such different backgrounds. Now, I want to, but whenever the word is used, there's always implied an opposition in two directions. You can be liberal as opposed to conservative in one direction, and you could be liberal as opposed to radical in the other direction. So you need three words in order to situate liberal. In one, you have conservative, you have liberal, and you have radical. And people often understand and use the word liberal in opposition to either conservative this way, or radical this way. That is, conservative on the right and radical on the left, and liberal somewhere understood in opposition to these positions. And as far as liberals are concerned, both oppositions, conservative and radical, often share something in common. That is, they emphasize the importance and significance of the state. Whereas liberals set themselves often in opposition to the significance and importance of the state, as I will try to explain. But I want to start by restoring, and the word liberal, I must say, and you will know this, is sometimes used positively and sometimes negatively, depending on your politics and your position. It can be both positive and negative, depending. Now I want to start by restoring to the positive meaning of liberalism its original usage. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. By returning to the cultural, personal, and meanings of the word liberal, to take it out of politics, so to speak, and restore it to culture. Of course, you can't do that completely, but I will start by making that step. But I also need to note, and you just need reminding, you know this, that liberal, the notion of being liberal is particularly associated with English language cultures in Britain and the United States. It's associated with those cultures since what is called in Britain the Glorious Revolution of 1689. I'll remind you what happened in 1689 in a minute. And since the American Revolution, which concluded in 1883, but centres on the Declaration of Independence in 1776. That is, if you're talking about the uses of the word liberal, you're talking about the modern period. And clearly there are significant connections between what is modern and being liberal in the language. Now, the glorious revolution in Britain of 1689 was the political event by which the Catholic King James II was removed from the crown because of his Catholicism. And Parliament brought in a new king, appointed its own king, William from the Netherlands. That is, it was the year in which finally in Britain the decision of where power lay was decided in favour of Parliament against the king. And that settlement of 1689, the drawing up of a new arrangement, there was no constitution, but an arrangement between Parliament and the king, is accepted to be the basis of modern British democracy and British political stability, perhaps more stability in democracy. And it's known in history as the Glorious Revolution, because it established the glory of Britain in a modern sense, as a modern nation, in which Parliament, the rule of law, rather than the king, had power. And that was then copied by the American Revolution, ironically against the British, establishing the United States Constitution, which is the most liberal of all political documents. Very significantly, the opening words of the American Constitution are, "We the people." That is the subject, the agent. I talk about agency. The very opening words of the American Constitution declare who has the agency. It is we the people. Now, as a result of these two British-American so-called revolutions, in a certain sense they were, it became understood that the liberty, and you can see here the common roots between the word liberal and liberty. I'll mention that in a minute. That liberty was focused upon the individual, and after these revolutions in Britain and the United States, the conception of the state was of an organisation created by we the people, for the purposes of the people. That is, it creates a notion of liberty based upon the individual as the object of politics, and that collective activity, the state, is organised for the benefit, for the good of individuals. This is the basis of liberal political theory. And I want to mention three things that seem to me to be three values, three good things that were central to the notion of this liberal settlement. Three things that were recognised by the members of Parliament in Britain and by the people who carried out the American Revolution. There were three social phenomena that were considered essential to a liberal society. The first was tolerance, to allow for individual differences, so that common organisation would have space for individuals to be individual, that is different, requires tolerance. And particularly they had in mind religious tolerance. That is, it involved the separating off of religious belief as something final for individual decision, not for the state. Secondly, value was autonomy. Individuals have and should be encouraged to have agency. Power should lie at the level of the individual capacity to act. And the third social good that was considered essential to these settlements was legal justice. That society must have an institutional structure which ensures that people are tolerant and do act with autonomy, guarantees their autonomy, and this is the legal system. Acting according to laws laid down by political representatives, but it is the legal system which can act, and it can act for individuals against the government as well as for the government against individuals. It's independent of any particular group. So I mentioned three things which seem to me to be fundamental to liberal thought, political thought: tolerance, individual autonomy, and law. And these three things are all characteristic of what many people call modernity. They go with, as I discussed, with Enlightenment modernity as commonly understood. Now, the way the word liberal is now used, it involves a mixture of political, cultural, moral, economic levels of meaning. And to sort out these different usages of the word, it's helpful to go back, and here I follow the Oxford English Dictionary, the Standard British Dictionary, to the Latin root of the word liberal, which is liberalis. And liberalis is a name for the qualities that a free man has. That is, the original notion of liberal, of what is liberal, develops with the notion of what is a free man, and the qualities that are characteristic of being a free man are liberal qualities. So it shares the root with the word liberty and with the word liberation. And these liberal qualities are qualities that only are special to being free. They're not qualities that a woman has, they're not qualities that slaves have, they're not qualities that barbarians have. They are qualities of the free political man in origin. Now let me go through 5 meanings of ways in which the word liberal is used. And starting with the one I particularly want to emphasize, and here I return to my opening statement. I want to put some positive value back into the word liberal, suggest where its roots of being a good value lie. And this is the word when it's used in such phrases as the liberal arts and a liberal education. And here the word liberal is contrasted, and this goes back to medieval usage, Renaissance, and before that to medieval times, in which the liberal arts, the liberal practical, the liberal things, the liberal studies are different from the practical arts of doing things, or from the professions, medicine, law, or theology. The liberal arts are the things that all students studied in the medieval curriculum, the trivium and then the quadrivium, grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, astronomy, music. These subjects were sometimes called the liberal arts. They're not subjects to train you to physically acquire a skill. And they are not subjects that train you to be a member of the professions of law, medicine, or theology. They are preparatory. They are what every person, every man needs in order to be a free man, needs these particular arts, and they are hence called the liberal arts, the arts which make a person the kind of person who has the qualities of being free. From the Renaissance onwards, the liberal arts then become the education which is appropriate for a gentleman, for a person who is not a worker, for a person who is not a merchant, but a person whose place in society comes from his qualities as a free person, a gentleman, a person who then shows those qualities through tolerance, autonomy, and respect for the law. And the training that was thought appropriate for a gentleman, the liberal arts training, became the classics, as it's known in English. The classics, meaning the study of Latin and Roman languages, Latin and Roman history and philosophy. The classics, as they're commonly called in English. And until the late 19th century, all educated men shared this common educational background. That is, they all shared a training in the liberal arts. And so, hence, the educated culture was one formed by a notion of what is proper to form a person, a man, as a liberal person. The classics, and sometimes mathematics. And then, from the end of the 19th century, classical education gradually disappears, but gets much less important in university education. And in the English-speaking world, in effect, the training of a gentleman comes more often not through the classics, but through literature. It is particularly the study of English literature that acquires the role in society of giving a person the kinds of qualities which are appropriate for being a tolerant, autonomous, and law-respecting citizen, being a good citizen. And indeed, the notion of the liberal arts changed during the 20th century into a notion of what subjects will be appropriate for good citizenship. And here we return to the humanities, which I discussed early on in the course. When people say, well, what's the use of the humanities? One of the standard answers is to say that they are subjects which make good citizens. And as you have a growing democracy, it is important that people within the nation share an education which equips them for rational decision-making within the political process. And that training is often said to come from the study of the humanities or the liberal arts. No longer usually the classics, but very often included philosophy, study of literature, history of art, and related to the study of areas of the social sciences, the thought, and so on. This is sheet of it. So, what we have is a long tradition going back to the medieval period and still continuing teaching of the humanities, that it is a liberal education in the liberal arts is appropriate for training, initially for training rulers, men who are going to rule, then for training gentlemen, and now for training the citizen. So you still have in the United States what are called liberal arts colleges. And the United States liberal arts college is not, it's like a university, but it teaches only the first years of the university, It has no research dimension and doesn't give doctorates. That is, it takes people 18, 19, and gives them a few years of a broad education to make them good citizens. Began in the 19th century to make men gentlemen, to treat them morality, to treat them the qualities appropriate for being leaders of society. Now, of course, it takes a much wider range of people, notably women, but still justifies itself, not as a university, but as a liberal arts college, on the basis that what it is focused upon is the creating of liberal people, in the sense of, in the medieval sense. There are links between the English language notion of a liberal education and the German notion of Bildung, as it got formation. Bildung literally means formation, self-formation, or the formation of culture through classics, philosophy, and the humanities disciplines. And the idea of Bildung, particularly associated with Wilhelm von Humboldt and the founding of the University of Berlin, 1809, creates ways of thinking that reinforce the position of the liberal arts within the culture, within European culture. I just want to mention the perhaps most famous English 19th century discussion of the liberal arts, which is in a series of lectures by John Henry Newman, who gave these lectures in 1852. And they were called The Idea of a University. John Henry Newman was most famous for being a member of the English church who converted to Catholicism. It was a very much discussed event. Britain's leading intellectual leaves the English church and joins the Catholic Church. Well, that's not and he indeed became a cardinal of the Catholic Church. But he, in his lectures about the idea of a university, argued for the purposes of a university being liberal education. And he very straightforwardly stated that liberal learning, liberal education, is distinctive because it is learning for its own sake. It's not for practical purposes. It's not to become a member of the professions. It's to become learned. So, I quote, liberal education, this is Newman, liberal education viewed in itself is simply the cultivation of the intellect as such. And the object of liberal education is nothing more or less than intellectual excellence. The idea of a university is that it cultivates intellectual excellence. That's it. And this is understood to be a liberal education because being intellectually excellent is the kind of quality that a free man has. It's what distinguishes a free man from an unfree man, an ignorant man, an uneducated person. It is this kind of excellence. And as Newman went on to say, he said, everything has its own perfection, be it higher or lower in the scale of things. And he then turns to the Aristotelian notion, what is excellent for a human being, what is excellent for a human being, what is naturally excellent for a human being, is the cultivation of the intellect. And Newman draws upon the Christian Aristotelian tradition and argues that the idea of a university is to cultivate the intellect as the proper end of a Christian gentleman. This is a liberal education. Now, as I have said already, this notion of liberal education during the 20th century becomes much more democratic. It includes women, and it spreads outwards from the specific focus on classics to include the whole range of the humanities. But if you wish to say why should anybody study philosophy or the art or literature, and say, well, what good does it do? Then the answer, Newman and many those who believe in liberal education would say the answer lies in the fact that education is itself a good thing. That is, this is the good of life for a human being, is to be educated. And this is what an institution such as this offers. This is the liberal argument. Now we can come back to this. The second way in which the word liberal is used is to describe the qualities that a free man has. I first used it to describe education, learning. Secondly, liberal refers to the qualities of a free man. And this again has roots in Aristotelian ethics. A free man is a person who has virtues exercised for their own sake, which realize the perfection of being a human being. That is, that liberal qualities are not utilitarian qualities. I talked about utility. Liberal qualities are specifically not utilitarian. They're not judged by increase of happiness, some kind of measurable good in terms of physical well-being or health, but they are in themselves virtues. And in practice, the virtues of a liberal man are those of somebody who is generous, who is educated, who is open-hearted, and is tolerant or merciful. That is, willing to accept the difference of others, even to show mercy, that is, forgiveness to the badness of others. In practice, the liberal qualities have been these Christianized virtues associated with being a gentleman, generous, open-hearted, tolerant, merciful, educated. And this usage has led to a very, what is a metaphorical usage, to use the word liberal to describe a generous amount of something. So I can have a slice of bread and I can put jam on it, and I can put a generous amount, I can put a liberal amount of jam on the bread. I might say to you, you're very liberal with the jam, and you use a lot of it. And I could describe somebody as very liberal with her time. She's very liberal with her time. As in, she will make time to talk to you. She's liberal with her time. And you can even, if I was being polite, I might describe a Russian lady of rather large proportions. I might say she has liberal proportions. That is, she's not fat, she's liberal. It's a way of describing a quantity.
Very unusual way of...
No, it's quite common in English to say this, liberal proportions. I could be liberal with my money. I give it. You ask me, I give you money. I'm liberal with it. Generous. And it goes back to the being a gentleman, in which money doesn't have value, but being generous has value. A pre-modern appreciation of the virtues of the person. This use of the word generous is then linked with another one, the third usage, which is where the word liberal is used to indicate a lack of restraint in attitudes or opinions of speech. You can have a liberal attitude, hold liberal opinions, or speak liberally. And this means that you speak openly or freely. You don't hold back what you want to say. Interestingly, in the 17th century English, to describe somebody's speech as liberal was critical. They spoke too freely. And it's a bit like, if I understand it correctly, the Russian word liberalny. It's too free in speech. But since the 19th century, to be liberal in speech has become a good thing. And so I could say that I hold liberal opinions. My views are open. I don't have, I listen to different points of view. I don't, and I talk freely. Or I can say this is a liberal interpretation. You have a text, and so it says means this, it means that. I say no, it means this and it means that. That's a liberal interpretation because I'm open to different possibilities in the meaning of the text. Yes.
That's an unusual way of using words.
Yes. Well, and then you can get a phrase like, she talked liberally. It might mean she talked openly, or it might mean she talked a lot. So it can be both, and you have to understand which it means in the context. She talked liberally, open talk, or too much talk. And this then leads into the fourth meaning, which is again closely linked, that a liberal person or a liberal opinion, a liberal view, is a person or a view that is free or relatively free from narrow prejudice, that doesn't assume it knows the answers, but is open to a range of possibilities. So it's like the word open-minded. Liberal opinion. It's open-minded opinion of a person or a group. You could say it's a liberal society, meaning, well, it doesn't define too closely what people should do. It allows for a range of possibilities of actions. It lets people decide for themselves. Now, this usage of the word liberal is closely linked to the history of Enlightenment since the 18th century, when to be liberal was to, very specifically, to be opposed to conservatism. That is, to be liberal was to be open to the results of reasoning, as opposed to simply accepting what people say, accepting accepted opinions. That is, for much of its history, this usage of the word liberal has been opposed to conservatism, to reaction, to dogma, and particularly to dogmatic religion. And in its opposition to these things, conservatism, dogmatism, dogmatic religion, liberalism merges into radicalism. Radicalism is a much stronger form of criticism of prejudice, conservatism, established views. It's an attempt systematically to criticize them. Whereas the liberal opinion says, we won't allow dogma, but we don't particularly wish to destroy people from holding those opinions. The radical wishes to change them. But you can see that the liberal position and the radical one are continuous with each other. You can have every degree of position. Now, historically, this usage of the word liberal is, of course, associated with arguments for freedom of speech, and also with the rise of democracy. Now, I'm not going to talk about democracy particularly, but historical fact, of course, as you know, we have to recognise the significance of the relationship between arguments for being liberal and the actual development of political opposition to conservatism and the introduction of freedom of speech, for example, about religious questions, the ending of laws of blasphemy, for example, in most European countries, and the development of a form of political organisation that is, allows the freedom of speech of all groups within society, particularly working groups of women. Now, here I want to talk, just make one or two comments about the English church, the Anglican church. Because it seems to me to be an institution, a religious institution, which in many respects is liberal. And it's an important aspect of English life. There is a different church in Scotland, of the Anglican church, that it was a church that took its shape as a result of the revolution, the so-called revolution of 1689, the settlement between Parliament and the King. And that settlement was, after 1689, was also after the Civil War in the mid-17th century. And there was a determination that the state of civil war should not be repeated. And the church was part of the political process and adopted a basic position of tolerance. That is, it was a church that allowed for some degree of disagreement over dogma, over fundamental belief, in the political interests of tolerance. And the Anglican Church has continued to be what is called a broad church. It is, on several occasions, given priority to keeping together a group of people, rather than arriving at a particular agreement about what is correct in religious belief. It's given priority to the social unity, rather than the decision about the principles of dogma. In this sense, it's a liberal church, very different from the Russian Pravoslav Church, which is an intolerant church, a conservative as opposed to liberal organisation in its basic structure. And so, this liberal Anglicanism has its critics who say that it's so broad, it in effect has no belief. That is, it's so given priority to social unity that it has lost Christian belief. This would be the very conservative criticism of that church. Similarly, it has its critics for its current liberal position about the place of women within the priesthood. And that, of course, is an issue that strongly divides conservative and liberal churches. And well, you're familiar from these kinds of debates. But I mentioned the Anglican Church because it is the social institution which most obviously makes English culture special in a liberal sense. Even in the area of religion, there is a structure which encourages a liberal values. And as you know, its relation to politics is close, in that the Queen remains the head of the church. She is formally titled Defender of the Faith, but the faith that she defends has nothing to do with dogma. It has to do with an institution that is part of the liberal political settlement of 1689. Right, now I want to move to the politics of the word liberal. all the uses that I've given you already about acquiring a liberal education, about having liberal qualities, about lack of restraint in freedom of attitude and opinion, and freedom from narrow prejudice are all qualities which are associated with individualism. That is, with placing the value on the quality of the individual rather than the quality of the collective, as the base for judging society. And with the political argument of political theory that the purpose of political organisation is the people, is individuals. That individuals are natural, and that the political arrangements are created historically for the values that you can locate within individuals. And the usage of the word liberal in politics is associated, of course, with this set of individualistic beliefs that individuals, the person is natural, and the state, law, social institutions are historically created on the base of natural, by the coming together of natural individuals. And so it's a political tradition which rejects notions that there are certain collective things, such as nations, or land, or fatherland, which are natural, and which rejects the view that they have some kind of ontological priority over the individual person. It allows the fact, of course, that people may have feelings of identity coming from fatherland, or nation, or race. And for individuals, these things may feel sacred. But the liberal position is that they are and have to be understood to be historical creations, which in principle can be altered. That is, they are not sacred. Now, political usage. Let me briefly mention 4 characteristics of political usage of the word liberal. Firstly, I've been talking about it presupposes individualism. And that often goes with liberals, well, not just with individualism, but an actual suspicion, a skepticism, even an antagonism to the state and state institutions. There is a fear of the state, or a dislike of the state. At the same time, a recognition that certain institutions are necessary to maintain some level of ordered relationships among individuals. And the institution which is held to do that is not the state, but the law. That is, that liberals give priority to the law over the state in the maintenance of individual relationships. And in a book, the classic statement of modern English liberalism is John Stuart Mill's book. There is a sheet of paper somewhere to lecture, and I've arrived at the 5th meaning of the word liberal, and I'm talking about political usages. John Stuart Mill's book on liberty, published in 1859, same year as Darwin's Origin of Species, it is the classic statement of liberal values at the base of political organisation. And it's a book very noteworthy for its suspicion of the state. And that suspicion of the state is famously summarised in the aphorism of the English historian Lord Acton, who wrote that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. A very famous English aphorism. And it's expressive of liberal principles, that what one has to ensure is that power does not accumulate in one institution, let alone one individual within a state. And that what is needed to control that is a legal system, and a balance of powers, but focused upon the legal system. You're familiar with these principles of liberal politics. The second characteristic, the first, the individualism. The second is that as a matter of historical fact, liberal politics is associated with being reform-minded. This is a useful notion, I think, of being reform-minded. That is, having a mind that is supportive of change to improve things. It's an anti-conservative position. It's a pro-reform position. And this originates in the late 17th century, in the 18th century Enlightenment, in which to be liberal was to be opposed to the existing political powers, centralised powers of tsars and kings and the churches. And to use reason, enlightened reason, to turn to enlightened reason as an alternative, as the base from which to criticise prejudice and non-liberal thinking, to expose the lack of reason within established ways of organising politics. This is the principles of enlightenment. But it means that people who have been described as liberal or have accepted being called liberal have often been people associated with reform. That is with the opening up of the political process, with attempts to recreate ways of life, to spread wealth, to educate the population, and so on, with what in English is called reform. In its modern, in my generation, reform meant things like homosexual reform, it meant things like ending capital punishment, it meant attempts to change the prison system. These are what is usually denoted by reform. It meant attempts to create a system of kindergartens. It gets sad for mothers that they have a choice between work and childcare. These kinds of things are what constitute liberal reform in my generation. Now, this association of being liberal and being committed to reform, it's against conservatism until the late 19th century. Then there begins to be a shift. So that in much of the 20th century, these have not just been against conservatism, they have been strongly against radicalism, because radicalism from the late 19th century began to take organised form in working class politics, and then later in Bolshevik and socialist states. That is, the opposition to being liberal until the late 19th century came from conservatism. But then it began to be felt that the opposition to liberalism, that is the building up of the state, of centralised state powers, lay not with the conservatives, but with working class and socialist principles. And this then puts liberals into a dilemma from with which they then try to live and still have to live. That is, what is their relationship to democracy? If democracy then elects governments which are not liberal, say communist or fascist. And history of the 20th century has seen, and come back to this point, the central problem for liberalism, that is, what is its response when faced by political systems that deny liberal values, whether from fascism or from Bolshevism.
Very controversial, I suppose.
Well, I'm trying to make a descriptive observation of what liberals have faced. Whether or not whatever position I might hold about these issues, my position becomes clear, of course. But I'm making a historical point. And I think it's very important to be aware of this, that whereas liberals were against conservatism until the 20th century, in the 20th century, they've been against radical politics. Radicalism either of the fascist kind or radicalism of the Bolshevik kind. Because both...
Isn't this the kind of radicalism?
Not at all.
Political?
Not at all. But it shares in common from the liberal perspective that both systems emphasize the importance of state power. What? The importance of, from the liberal perspective, the fascist and the Bolshevik systems share one central thing in common, which is belief that change and power must be exercised from the centre, not through the agency of individuals, but from the agency of the central state. And in some cases, belief in one person. In fascism, through one person. Yes, this is different from the socialist system, which is completely different. But of course, in the case of the Soviet system, it became closer of one-person power.
So you mean that
during the Stalinist period. I think words like fascism and Bolshevism should be used very carefully and precisely, particularly now. And I'm here trying to refer precisely to the political systems that existed in the 20th century. So I'm not talking about the present, I'm talking about the 20th century.
So communism and fascism are equal in political respect?
Absolutely not. I didn't say that. I said they shared a particular characteristic. One, they differ in many positions, but one they share, and it's rather important. And I emphasise this because I'm talking from the perspective of how a liberal sees it. And what a liberal sees is that they share one thing in common, and that is the emphasis upon the state as the agent. Not the individual, but the state as the agent. So I'm trying to be as clear as I can. Of course I don't want to say that they're the same, not at all. No. You must get clear about that. I have many positive things to say about a socialist system. I have nothing positive to say about a fascist system. Let me be clear. I regard fascism with utter contempt. Okay, I've said something clear for once. Let me come to the third characteristic of political liberal. And this is the understanding that to be liberal in attitudes and opinions in politics requires freedom, autonomy, agency in economic matters. This is, of course, extremely important to contemporary notions of being liberal. There is the argument that you can be politically free only if you are economically free. And the basis for economic freedom is that the individual should be free to take economic decisions for her or himself. And this, of course, implies a market in economic relations as opposed to central state planning of economic matters. No. The fourth characteristic of being liberal is to be liberal in morals. And this grows out of the tradition of tolerance within liberal thinking, going back to the late 17th century. That is, if individuals are what matters, and individuals differ, then political organisation must take account of difference. Taking account of difference requires tolerance because people are indeed different. And to be liberal in morals, to describe somebody as liberal, meaning that they're liberal in morals, is very common, particularly since the 1960s, with the so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s. The sexual revolution was more than whatever that might mean. There are a range of factors, but you find that liberals are generally supportive of reproductive controls. That is, use of regulation of giving people the choice, the autonomy, the agency to take decisions about reproductive matters above all through the PID. The PID, as it's known in English. Support for abortion rights for women, supports for homosexuality, and homosexual reform in Britain came in the mid-1960s. The ending of capital punishment, and so on. To support these kinds of social policies is usually described as liberal within the English language. And these reforms then are basic to the development of the modern women's movement, to modern feminism, which is liberal in the sense that it is committed to making the qualities that have been traditionally associated with the free man available to the free woman. But within feminism there is a whole range between liberal, not conservative, but liberal and radical opinion, a whole range. Now, these four characteristics, individualism, reform-minded, economic independence, and liberal morals, are characteristic of the liberal person. And you should note that in English usage, a liberal person is spelled with a little l, a lowercase l. And if you describe a person as a liberal with a big L, a capital L, in English, you're describing a member of a political party. So you have a liberal person, but you have a liberal who is a member of a particular party. You need to know the difference between these two. Perhaps you're familiar with this. So I should say something about the Liberal Party in Britain. The Liberal Party becomes known as such in the Victorian period, second half of the 19th century. Before that, the Liberal Party was called the Whig Party. And there was the Whig Party and the Tory Party. These names, they are nicknames. Nicknames are informal names for two groups of two political parties, the Whig and the Tory. And those names go back to the 17th century. But in the 19th century, and the Whig Party was more reform-minded, and the Tory Party was conservative. In the 19th century, the Whig Party then gradually divides. And part of it becomes the Liberal Party. The more radical part of it becomes the Liberal Party. And the more conservative party goes into the Tory Party and forms the modern Conservative Party in Britain. And particularly the Liberal Party, the new Liberal Party, divided into conservative and more radical part over the question of Ireland. That is, the more reform-minded wanted to give Ireland its independence, and this was opposed by those who wished to keep Ireland as part of Britain, and they were called the Liberal Unionists. And there still are in the British Parliament Unionists who come from Northern Ireland, whose prime political commitment is to the keeping part of Ireland as within Britain. I'm explaining this to try and explain the word liberal, how it's used in relation to party politics. The Liberal Party then was faced at the end of the 19th century by the rise of a working class radical party, the Labour Party. And hence, after the First World War, the Liberal Party almost disappears. The country divides into the Conservative Party and the new Labour Party in terms of party politics. But the Liberal Party does not disappear and continues to have a few representatives through the 20th century, and in the last election came back as part of the government. The British government is mainly conservative, but has a small part which is what is now called the Liberal Democrats. So this is the history. They've come back into power, which they've not had since the time of the First World War. Okay, now let me come to my last bit. Let me briefly list standard, let me say very briefly something about contemporary usage of the word liberal. Because in contemporary usage it's clearly often used about economic questions. And in this context, people often refer to neoliberalism, new liberalism, neoliberalism. And this, I think, is helpful. What I've been talking about is classic liberalism. What we now have is neoliberalism, which is particularly focused upon the argument that the economic welfare of a country depends upon removing state controls over and action in the economic sector. Now I have to say, I'll try and say this clearly, I don't believe this ever happens. That is, I think in all countries the state plays a major role in economic activity. But clearly there are differences between an economic system that is organised around the interests of business and an economic system that is organised around the interests of the governing state. There are differences, as we well know. Now, the rise of modern neoliberalism, an emphasis upon liberal attitudes and way of life being dependent upon economic questions, lies, I think, in the 1920s. And what you have in the 1920s is the rise of socialism and the rise of fascism. And there is a liberal response, particularly associated with economists coming out of Vienna, sometimes called the Austrian school, who develop a critique of the direction of 20th century politics. And it's a critique which is both against the Bolsheviks and against the fascists. And the critique is based upon the argument that individual political freedoms depend upon economic freedoms, and that economic freedoms are denied both by fascist systems and by the Bolshevik system. And hence both systems lay the basis for a lack of political freedom. This is the argument of the Austrian school. And the most famous names associated with this argument are those of Ludwig von Mises, who in the 1920s drew together a very influential group of people interested in politics, economics, social policy questions in Vienna. And among those individuals who were drawn into Vienna School by von Mises was F.A. von Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, whose work now is regarded as the Bible of modern, contemporary neoliberalism. It's important to see that some of the contemporary arguments about the virtues of a liberal economic system have their basis within political arguments in the 1920s. Hayek wrote during the Second World War a book called The Roads to Serfdom. The Roads to Serfdom, to become slaves, the roads to becoming a slave. It's important he wrote it during the war because during wartime, the liberal, so-called liberal countries like Britain and the United States organized their economies centrally. That is, under wartime conditions, there was also central planning of the economies. And Hayek wished to argue, even during wartime, that that was politically dangerous, would lead to lack of freedom. And he was not listened to in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But then, in the late 70s, people began to listen to his arguments. And there was the turn in economic policy questions associated with the election of Margaret Thatcher in Britain in 1979 and the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States in 1980. And Reagan and Thatcher were both committed to the arguments of von Hayek. Thatcher, in particular, on a famous occasion during a meeting of the government, there was discussion of what their policies is. She reached into her portfolio briefcase and she put von Hayek's book on the table, his book called The Conditions of Liberty, and she said, "This is our policy." And his policy is very radical from the position that was dominant in British politics in the 1960s and 70s. Because it was an argument that the state should be taken out of ownership and taken out of economic planning. And those policies would then be put into practice. The British state sold everything it had. On the one side, people argue that this has benefited the efficiency and productivity of the country. On the other side, people argue that it has made the rich richer and the poor poorer. And here we're into politics, which your position is about neoliberal economic policies. And there is strong disagreement within British politics, within American politics, and elsewhere about these questions. But as you well know, many of the neoliberal arguments have become dominant within economic policy making around the world. And in contrast with classic liberalism, Because classic liberalism was associated with reform. And the carrying through of reforms was carried through by states. That is, classic liberalism was open to the argument that the state has a role in education, in healthcare, in national insurance, in the ownership of certain key industrial sectors, maybe power or water, for example, electricity or water, whereas the neoliberals are opposed to the state in all these sectors, health, education, and certainly in the ownership of production. As philosophers, I should say that Hayek, interestingly, was a cousin of Wittgenstein. Small Austrian intellectual elite. And Hayek collected many biographical materials about Wittgenstein. And so the leading resource for writing the biography of Wittgenstein comes from the materials that Hayek collected. He was a highly educated man. His books are interesting, though I have many disagreements with them. Now, let me just list standard criticisms made of the liberal position. If I am being liberal, it's part of my job as a liberal to be open to the criticisms of the position that I myself hold. Part of my use of my intellect, liberal intellect, is to criticise itself. Standard criticisms of being liberal. Firstly, it conceptualises the individual as if individuals had some kind of non-social existence. There's something wrong about the liberal conception of being a person. It's as if people were naturally not social, whereas it's possible to conceptualize the notion of a person as an intrinsically socially embedded agent. So there's a philosophical problem, much discussed philosophy of social sciences, about the conceptualization of the individual within liberalism. Second criticism, liberals have been reluctant or even unable to address questions of power. That is, if you think politics is about power, it's not clear how liberals have responded to questions of power. And this, the liberal response has been to say, let us reason. Let us examine what reason teaches us will be for the benefit of social well-being. This is the Enlightenment starts. Let's turn to knowledge of human nature, let's turn to science, and let's use our reason to organise things for the benefit of all. And the principle of utility is a consequence of this kind of enlightenment. But then, faced in the 20th century by the rise of non-liberal politics, particularly by the rise of fascism, liberals failed to resist. What was it about the liberal arguments that made them unsuccessful in resisting the rise of fascism? And it was the result of the rise of fascism that led many English language liberals into sympathy with communism. Because communism did appear to offer resistance to the rise of fascism in a way that liberal democracies did not. Italy, Germany, large parts of political elite in France, in Hungary, in Spain, Portugal, in Greece, went fascist. Elements of society were fascist. There was some evident failure of liberal position in these circumstances. Same criticism of being liberal for its failure to understand power, the structures of society which distribute power, of course, came from Marxists. Marxist criticism is that liberalism is the ideology of the bourgeoisie, expressive of the interests of a particular class of society, not expressive of the objective interests of the bulk of the people, that is, of the working people. And that the failure of liberalism, Marxists have argued, lies within its unwillingness to deal with questions like the unequal access to justice within liberal societies. In fact, a matter of fact, the rich have more access to the legal system than the poor, for example. That the liberal system has, in fact, tolerated not just difference of belief, but has tolerated oppression through its own colonial system, through the position of women, of working people, and so on in the society. You're familiar with the Marxist criticism of liberalism. It has to be taken very seriously. Third criticism is the one which I have already mentioned, that historically, though liberalism, being liberal, is associated with supporting the rise of democracy, it has been put in a dilemma what to do when democracy produces government which is anti-liberal. As many modern or contemporary liberals feel is the case in present, that when the majority of the people is conservative, is committed to support for irrational values like nationalism, what is the relationship of the liberal position to such politics? And it's led many liberals to be critical of the democratic process, or to be suspicious of democracy. And somebody like Hayek certainly was suspicious of democracy, was not at all sure that democracy is the best form of political organisation, because it allows for a majority to oppress minorities. And that this discussion by liberals of fear of democracy has its classic discussion in the famous book by Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, from 1835. It's regarded as a book which foresees the problems that will come with the majority democratically electing a government that oppresses minorities. And the fourth criticism that I should mention is the criticism that comes from conservatives. And it's the criticism that there are certain social phenomena, social institutions, such as the fatherland, or the nation, or the race, which actually hold society together, and that liberals fail to recognise the significance and indeed sacredness of these social entities. And this is the kind of criticism you find within nationalist reactions to liberal values. That there is something sacred about the collectivities in which we live. Now, I come to my conclusion, and it's also the conclusion of the course. And my conclusion I want to put to you, half seriously, half as self-reflection, is that this course is liberal performance. That by coming, you have taken part in the constitution of a liberal society. In what sense is it liberal performance? Well, firstly, the lectures are open, tolerant of everybody. And this institution has supported that. That is, it has demonstrated its liberal attitude by making the lectures open. And I, as a teacher, am open because I welcome everybody. Secondly, the economic base. You don't pay, and I'm not paid. So we all are committed to the liberal arts. That is why we're here, for our intellects. You're not going to become rich or develop your career as a result of the course of these lectures. I'm not going to become famous. That is, its performance in the liberal arts. And especially because actually there is no financial exchange. It's interesting. Medieval, this is a medieval course. It's not a modern one. There's no contract. Our goal is not utility, though I hope there is utility. In a sense, part of it is utility, in that there's language use. And I think that's properly described as the utilitarian criteria for judging, of course, whether or not it is contributed to facility, usage of language. We freely give, we are liberal with our time. We give our time, you come, I sit, I talk. My lectures are liberal-minded. They're free from narrow prejudice, I think. They are intended to be free from narrow prejudice. I would be deeply disturbed if you thought they were prejudiced in a narrow sense. Of course, I express views in my lectures, but they're free from narrow prejudice, and I would listen if you criticised some position I take. We had a discussion about my appearing to link communism and fascism. Right, what you said. So I listened, and you listened to me, so we were liberal. In coming together, we in fact create a civil society. It's very small, but we create a civil society which is free from the state. What we do here is our decision. It is not directly structured or influenced by the state. It is a result of our coming to agree together to do what we do. And by sitting together in this way, we are open and we demonstrate it's perfectly possible to get together, having a social arrangement, which is very orderly, but is not directed by the state. We can do it ourselves, we can organise ourselves. We don't need government. And here we come to the problem. Getting together like this, we demonstrate. I haven't discussed power, and we have no power. That is our liberal social arrangements and our liberal qualities that we have do not contribute to a redistribution of power within the actual social arrangements within which we exist. We're small, but we don't have power. This illustrates the liberal dilemma. What is the relationship between the kind of liberal qualities that we might support, and whether or not you think you support them. You have supported them by going here, is my argument. You've performed being liberal. Whatever your thoughts, you've performed being liberal. And so, my first question, in what sense could it be said that the course has empowered you? That is, has it been possible in some way for performing liberal qualities empowered, that is, added to your sense of agency, perhaps through language or in some other way? I stop at this point, thank you.